deep in the Canadian Arctic. There's an island that most Canadians have never heard of, an island where the midnight sun reveals secrets that nations would rather keep hidden, an island that sits at the crossroads of global superpowers, melting ice, and territorial disputes that could reshape the world as we know it. This is the story of Hans Island, a tiny speck of rock that sparked an international incident, became the subject of the world's most polite territorial dispute, and ultimately revealed just how high the stakes really are in the Arctic. But here's what they're not telling you. Hans Island was never really about Hans Island at all. Welcome to Canada's forgotten Arctic frontier, where strategic secrets hide beneath layers of ice and diplomacy. What if I told you that a barren rock smaller than Central Park, just 1.3 square kilometers, nearly caused an international crisis between two NATO allies? What if I told you that this seemingly worthless piece of frozen real estate is actually sitting on top of one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth? Hans Island sits in the Kennedy Channel, right in the middle of the Nares Strait, which separates Greenland from Canada's Ellesmere Island. To the untrained eye, it's nothing. No trees, no wildlife, no resources, just rock, ice, and howling Arctic winds. But to those who understand Arctic geopolitics, Hans Island is everything. For decades, Canada and Denmark engaged in what journalists lovingly called the Whisky War, a territorial dispute so Canadian that it involved planting flags, leaving bottles of alcohol, and politely taking turns claiming sovereignty. Danish officials would visit, plant their flag, and leave a bottle of Danish schnapps with a note saying, "Welcome to the Danish Island." Canadian forces would later arrive, replace it with a Canadian flag, and leave Canadian whiskey with their note. It sounds absurd. It sounds quaint. But behind this theatrical display of politeness lays something far more serious: the race for Arctic supremacy in the 21st century. Today, we're diving deep into why this forgotten island matters more than ever, what it reveals about the future of Arctic sovereignty, and the strategic secrets that major powers don't want you to understand. Let's talk about why location is everything. Hans Island sits in the Nares Strait, a narrow, ice-choked artery between Greenland and Canada's Ellesmere Island that connects the Arctic Ocean to Baffin Bay. It's not the main Northwest Passage route ships fantasize about, but it's still a critical Arctic choke point because it's one of the gateways where the Arctic ice and potentially future traffic flows south. And the Northwest Passage, that's the holy grail of Arctic navigation. It's the shortest route between Europe and Asia, potentially cutting thousands of nautical miles off traditional shipping routes that go through the Panama or Suez canals. For centuries, this passage was impassable, locked in ice year-round. Explorers died trying to find it. Ships were crushed in the ice. It was a frozen fortress that protected North America's northern border better than any military ever could. But climate change is rewriting the rules. Within the next few decades, late summer Arctic routes, including parts of the Northwest Passage, could become seasonably navigable for weeks or even months, something that was basically impossible for most of modern history. What once was a frozen wasteland is becoming a viable shipping route, fishing ground, and potential military corridor. And here's where Hans Island becomes critical. Controlling the waters around Hans Island means controlling one of the gateways between the Arctic Ocean and the North Atlantic. In military terms, that matters. It's not just about the island itself, it's about the waters around it. It's about territorial seas, exclusive economic zones, and the right to regulate who passes through. Think about it like this. Hans Island is the Panama Canal of the Arctic, except instead of a canal that one country controls, it's a natural strait that multiple nations want to claim jurisdiction over. Canada maintains that the Northwest Passage runs through internal Canadian waters, meaning Canada has the right to control and regulate all traffic. The United States, yes, even America, Canada's closest ally, disagrees, calling it an international strait where freedom of navigation applies. Hans Island was the test case. If Canada couldn't even definitively hold a tiny island in these waters, how could it claim sovereignty over the passage itself? The Whisky War more than meets the eye. The Whisky War began in 1973, when Canada and Denmark were negotiating their maritime boundary. Both countries claimed Hans Island, or Tartupaluk, as the island was called by the Inuit, but rather than resolve it, they simply drew their border right up to the island from each side, leaving its ownership ambiguous. For years, nothing happened. Then, in 1984, Canadian troops landed on Hans Island, planted a flag, and left a bottle of Canadian Club whiskey. Denmark's Minister of Greenland Affairs responded by personally traveling to the island, planting a Danish flag, and leaving a bottle of schnapps with a note saying, "Welcome to the Danish island." And so began decades of passive-aggressive flag planting. The media loved it. Headlines called it the friendliest war in history. Late-night comedians joked about it. It became a symbol of Canadian politeness taken to absurd extremes. But intelligence analysts weren't laughing, because while Canada and Denmark were playing their theatrical game, other nations were watching very carefully. Russia was expanding its Arctic military presence. China was declaring itself a near-Arctic state, despite being nowhere near the Arctic. The United States was ramping up Arctic operations. The Whisky War wasn't really about whiskey, it was about precedent. It was about whether historical claims mattered in the Arctic or whether use it or lose it would become the new standard. It was about testing each other's resolve without crossing into actual conflict. And here's what most people miss. Both Canada and Denmark knew that leaving Hans Island unresolved was actually strategic. As long as the dispute existed, both countries had an excuse to maintain a visible presence in the area. Both could justify military exercises, sovereignty patrols, and infrastructure investments. The ambiguity was the point. By the 2010s, the game was changing. The Arctic was heating up, literally and figuratively. New players were entering the field, and Canada and Denmark realized that their polite dispute was creating an opening for others to question Arctic sovereignty more broadly. Something had to give. The 2022 resolution, a master class in diplomacy. On June 14, 2022, Canada and Denmark did something remarkable. They actually resolved the dispute. After 49 years, they split Hans Island down the middle, creating a land border between Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark via Greenland. It was the world's longest-running territorial dispute resolved through pure diplomacy. No shots fired, no threats made, no international arbitration required. The media celebrated it as a triumph of friendship and cooperation. Leaders from both nations posed for photos. There were smiles and handshakes. The internet rejoiced that the Whisky War had ended peacefully. But look deeper, and you'll see this wasn't just about resolving an old dispute. It was about sending a message to every other nation with Arctic ambitions. We own this. We have clear borders. We can work together, and we're united. The timing is crucial. This agreement came just months after Russia invaded Ukraine, triggering a massive reassessment of global security architecture. It came as China was dramatically increasing its Arctic research presence and making moves toward establishing a polar Silk Road. It came as the United States was publishing new Arctic strategies emphasizing military readiness. By resolving Hans Island, Canada and Denmark eliminated a source of Western division in the Arctic. They presented a united front. They demonstrated that Western democracies could settle disputes peacefully while others resorted to aggression. But they also established something more tangible: jurisdictional clarity. Now, there's no ambiguity about who controls what in the Nares Strait. The boundary is clear. The territorial seas are defined. The legal framework is established. And that matters enormously when the real competition begins. The real strategic secrets. So what are the actual strategic secrets that Hans Island reveals? What are the bigger forces at play? Secret number 1. The Arctic is the new great game. Just like the 19th century competition between the British and Russian empires for control of Central Asia, the Arctic is becoming the arena for 21st century geopolitical competition. But instead of cavalry and spies, it's icebreakers and surveillance systems. Russia has more than 40 icebreakers and is building more. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and is investing billions in Arctic research and shipping routes. The United States is finally waking up to the fact that it's been neglecting Arctic capabilities for decades. Canada, despite having the world's longest Arctic coastline, is mostly relying on one aging heavy icebreaker, the Louis S. St. Laurent, while its next-generation polar icebreaker keeps getting delayed. Meanwhile, Russia's got dozens, including nuclear ones. Hans Island forced Canada to confront this gap. If you can't maintain a presence on a single small island, how can you patrol an entire ocean? Secret number 2. It's not about resources, it's about routes. Everyone talks about Arctic oil and gas reserves. Yes, the U.S. Geological Survey estimates that 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of undiscovered natural gas are in the Arctic. But here's the secret. Extracting those resources is incredibly expensive and environmentally risky. The real prize is shipping routes. If the Northwest Passage becomes regularly navigable, it could revolutionize global trade. Ships traveling from Shanghai to New York could save 7,000 kilometers compared to the Panama Canal route. From northern Europe to Asia, the savings are even more dramatic. Whoever controls these routes, or even just monitors and regulates them, gains enormous economic and strategic leverage. Secret number 3. Climate change is the ultimate game changer. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The countries most positioned to benefit from Arctic opening are also among the world's largest contributors to climate change. There's a perverse incentive structure where melting ice creates new economic opportunities while simultaneously causing global catastrophe. Hans Island sits in the center of this paradox. Its resolution was necessary precisely because the ice that once made it irrelevant is now disappearing. The world is literally changing around it. Secret number 4. Indigenous sovereignty is the elephant in the room. Throughout the entire Hans Island saga, one voice was consistently marginalized: the Inuit. The Inuit have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years. Their territory spans what we now call Canada, Greenland, Alaska, and Russia. They don't recognize colonial borders the way Southern governments do. The 2022 agreement between Canada and Denmark included consultation with Inuit representatives, a significant improvement over historical practice. But the fundamental question remains: who really has the right to decide the fate of Arctic territories? This isn't just a moral question, it's a legal one. Indigenous rights are increasingly recognized in international law. Future Arctic disputes may hinge not on historical colonial claims, but on indigenous sovereignty and land rights. Secret number 5. The next flashpoint is already here. When Hans Island was resolved, the larger Arctic boundary disputes are just heating up. Canada, Denmark, and Russia are all making submissions to the United Nations regarding their claims to the continental shelf under the Arctic Ocean, including potentially the North Pole itself. These claims overlap significantly. Russia is particularly aggressive in its assertions, claiming a massive underwater ridge system as an extension of Siberia. Hans Island was practice, The real game is just beginning. What this means for the future. So where does this leave us? Hans Island's resolution shows both the best and worst of how Arctic sovereignty will be determined. The best. Two democracies can peacefully resolve disputes through diplomacy. The worst, that only worked because both parties were Western allies with shared values and security interests. What happens when disputes involve nations that don't share those values? What happens when economic interests conflict more directly? What happens when military considerations override diplomatic niceties? The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. Within our lifetimes, it will be fundamentally transformed. New shipping routes will open. Resources will become accessible. Military assets will be repositioned. Indigenous communities will face unprecedented changes. And Canada sits at the center of it all, with the longest Arctic coastline, but arguably the weakest capacity to defend it. Here's what needs to happen. First, Canada needs serious investment in Arctic infrastructure. Icebreakers, ports, surveillance systems, and search and rescue capabilities. The current gap is embarrassing and dangerous. Second, Indigenous communities must have a genuine seat at the table. Not consultation as an afterthought, but true partnership in decision-making. They understand the Arctic better than any Southern government ever will. Third, international frameworks need updating. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was written for a world with permanent Arctic ice. We need new agreements that address the realities of an ice-free Arctic. Fourth, environmental protection must be prioritized. The same forces opening the Arctic are destroying it. Increased shipping brings risk of oil spills, noise pollution, and ecosystem disruption. Military activity brings similar concerns. Finally, the world needs transparency about Arctic activities. The more secret bases, undisclosed military exercises, and ambiguous territorial claims exist, the higher the risk of miscalculation and conflict. Conclusion: Hans Island is a tiny piece of rock in a massive ocean. It has no permanent residence, no strategic resources, no inherent value. And yet it tells us everything we need to know about the 21st century. It tells us that climate change is redrawing not just coastlines, but geopolitical boundaries. It tells us that the old rules, the ones written when the Arctic was permanently frozen, no longer apply. It tells us that cooperation is possible, but not guaranteed. It tells us that what seems like a quirky historical footnote can actually be a window into global power dynamics. The Whiskey War is over, but the battle for the Arctic has just begun. Canada and Denmark showed us how it should be done, with patience, diplomacy, and mutual respect. But they also revealed how precarious Arctic sovereignty really is. One small island took half a century to resolve. Hundreds of similar disputes remain. As the ice melts, the world is discovering a new frontier. And just like every frontier in history, it will be contested, fought over, and ultimately defined by those willing to invest in claiming it. The question isn't whether the Arctic will change, it already is. The question is whether that change will be managed peacefully or catastrophically. Hans Island was a test. Canada and Denmark passed. But the real exam, that's coming soon. The Arctic is no longer forgotten, and neither should be the strategic lessons it offers about our rapidly changing world. Thanks for watching. If this video made you think differently about the Arctic, or about how seemingly small territorial disputes can reveal massive geopolitical shifts, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden forces shaping our world. And let me know in the comments, do you think Canada is doing enough to protect its Arctic sovereignty? Or is the North being forgotten while the world watches? See you in the next one.